The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was tucked into my mailbox between a coupon for 20% off gutter cleaning and a flyer for a psychic who, for a nominal fee, could tell me if my pets were happy. The envelope was a crisp, offensive shade of manila, bearing the official crest of the Pleasant View Acres. Homeowners Association. A single, perfectly rendered oak tree devoid of any personality whatsoever. It had the weight of a death sentence, or at least the death of joy, which in the suburbs is basically the same thing. I stood there on my lawn, a patch of grass I spend 52 weekends a year nurturing to the exact shade of green mandated by the HOA's quarterly newsletter. And I knew. Before I even broke the seal, I knew this was her doing. Carol Fromp. Even her name sounded like a disappointed sigh. She was the newly elected president of the HOA, a woman who moved through the world as if she were perpetually searching for a loose thread on a stranger's sweater. Carol was the human embodiment of the color beige. She saw our neighborhood not as a place where people lived, but as a large-scale diorama of suburban perfection that was constantly under threat from things like unapproved mailbox flags and excessively cheerful welcome mats. My crime, I knew, was my unbridled, unapologetic love for inflatable holiday decorations. You see, for 11 months of the year, I am a model citizen of Pleasant View Acres. I'm Leo Maxwell, the guy in 4B with the obsessively edged lawn and the recycling bins that are never, ever put out before 7 p.m. the night before pickup. I nod politely. I wave. I pretend to be interested when my neighbor, Bob, tells me about the new blend of fertilizer he's using. I play the game. But on the day after Thanksgiving, I transform. The garage door rolls up and out comes the army. My symphony of nylon and regret, as my wife, Sarah, lovingly calls it. We're not talking about one or two quaint little blow-up snowmen. Oh no, I'm a collector, a connoisseur. I had a 12-foot Frosty who wore a top hat at a jaunty angle and held a disco ball in one hand. I had a full team of 8 reindeer, all of them looking slightly concussed, pulling a sleigh piloted by a Santa who looked suspiciously like a member of the Hells Angels. There was a Grinch, leaning against my prize-winning Japanese maple with a shifty expression, and a squad of penguins who were meant to be caroling, but looked more like they were plotting a heist. My pièce de résistance was a massive inflatable snow globe with a tiny, perpetually confused-looking village inside, where fake snow swirled in a dizzying vortex 24 hours a day. It was glorious. It was tacky. It was the one time of year my house screamed, "Someone with a pulse and a questionable sense of humor lives here." Carol Fromp hated it with the fire of 1,000 suns. Last year, during her campaign for HOA presidency, her entire platform was based on restoring aesthetic harmony to the neighborhood. This was, of course, a thinly veiled crusade against my festive battalion. I'd seen her, a few weeks prior, walking her perfectly coiffed miniature poodle past my house. She didn't look at my home. She surveyed it, her eyes lingering on my inflatable Santa's leather vest like it was a personal insult. She gave me a tight little smile, the kind of smile a botanist might give a particularly resilient weed, and said, "Quite the display, Mr. Maxwell." "It brings joy, Carol," I'd said, puffing out my chest. "Does it?" she'd replied, her voice as crisp as a starched collar. "Or does it bring down property values?" So, holding that manila envelope, I knew. My fingers, trembling with a mixture of rage and resignation, tore it open. The paper was thick, expensive. They'd clearly spared no expense in drafting my execution order. The words swam before my eyes. Pursuant to a unanimous vote by the Pleasant View Acres Architectural Review Committee, the Board of Directors has ratified a new amendment to the community bylaws, effective immediately. I scanned down, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Article 9, Section 4B. The ban on pressurized seasonal air-filled effigies. There it was, couched in the most soulless, bureaucratic language imaginable. They didn't just ban inflatable decorations. They banned pressurized, seasonal air-filled effigies. It sounded like a regulation from a dystopian sci-fi movie, not a rule for a neighborhood where the biggest controversy used to be whose turn it was to clean the community pool skimmer. The reasoning provided was a masterclass in passive-aggressive nonsense. They cited concerns over aesthetic continuity, the potential for auditory disruption from blower motors, and my personal favorite, the risk of unsecured decorations becoming wind-related hazards. As if my 12-foot Frosty was going to detach from his moorings and take out a satellite. I read it 3 times, hoping it was a particularly unfunny prank. But the embossed seal at the bottom was real. My army had been decommissioned. My symphony was silenced. Carol Frump had won. I walked inside, the letter clenched in my fist. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming along to some indie rock station while chopping vegetables with terrifying precision. She's the calm, rational center of my universe, the one who keeps me from doing things like trying to build a moat around our property to keep the HOA out. She looked up and saw my face. Her humming stopped. "Oh no," she said, putting the knife down. "What is it? Did Bob complain about the height of our hedges again?" "Worse," I said, my voice a hollow whisper. I held out the letter. "They've killed Christmas, Sarah. They've stomped on its neck with the beige jackboot of conformity." She took the letter, her brow furrowed. She read it, and then read it again. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. I knew that smile. It was her, "Oh, Leo, what are you going to do now?" Smile. It was the smile she had when I announced I was going to build a wood-fired pizza oven in the backyard from scratch after watching a single YouTube video. "Pressurized seasonal air-filled effigies," she read aloud, a note of amusement in her voice. Wow, they really put some effort into that. "Don't you see the tyranny in this?" I asked, pacing the kitchen floor. "This isn't about aesthetics. This is about control. Today they come for the inflatable reindeer. Tomorrow, they'll be measuring the height of our welcome mats and issuing fines for non-regulation wreath sizes." "They already do that for the wreaths," she reminded me gently. "Remember Mrs. Henderson's unapproved poinsettia cluster incident last year?" "Exactly. The precedent has been set." I threw my hands up in the air. "What are we supposed to do? Just string up a few pathetic lights and call it a day? Surrender to the blandness? Let Carol Frump and her cabal of colorphobes dictate the terms of our joy?" Sarah finished chopping a carrot and slid the pieces into a bowl. She looked at me, her head tilted. "Well, we could just do more lights this year. Some really nice ones. Maybe a projector that puts little snowflakes on the garage door." I stopped pacing and stared at her, aghast. "A projector? Sarah, a projector is the decorative equivalent of a white flag. It's surrender. It's admitting that Carol Frump has broken my spirit." I walked over to the window and looked out at my perfect, boring lawn. It was a blank canvas. An insult. For 11 months it was their lawn, but for 1 month it was my lawn. And they had taken that from me. A feeling began to bubble up from the pit of my stomach, pushing past the despair. It was a familiar feeling. It was the same feeling I got when the self-checkout machine told me to place the item in the bagging area for the 5th time. It was righteous, petty indignation, and it was the most powerful fuel I knew. I turned back to Sarah, a dangerous glint in my eye. "They banned air-filled effigies," I said slowly, the words tasting like sweet, delicious rebellion. "They were very, very specific." Sarah sighed and picked up her knife again, but the corner of her mouth was twitching. "Leo, don't!" "They said nothing about solid-state effigies," I continued, my voice growing stronger. Nothing at all about decorations carved from other materials. They left a loophole, Sarah. A big, beautiful, stupid loophole. It's not a loophole. It's just the end of the sentence, she said. But there was no conviction in her voice. She knew me too well. She knew that in the war against the HOA, I treated the bylaw book like a sacred text to be studied, interpreted, and exploited. And I declared to the kitchen, to my loving and long-suffering wife, and to the ghost of Christmas joy past, I'm going to drive a truck right through it. The next 48 hours were a blur of spite-fueled research. My day job, something to do with marketing analytics that I can barely explain to myself, let alone others, was completely forgotten. My computer screen was a mosaic of increasingly unhinged search terms: giant lawn ornaments, HOA loophole decorations, legal ways to annoy your neighbors festively. I descended into the deepest, weirdest corners of the internet. My initial brainstorming session was, I'll admit, a little rough. I kept a running list in a notebook, which I titled Operation Festive Fury. Operation Festive Fury. Rejected Concepts. A Santa Claus built entirely of Christmas hams. Pros: hilarious, deliciously fragrant. Cons: would attract every stray dog, raccoon, and bear in a 50-mile radius. Also prohibitively expensive. The ham Santa budget was shot down by my wife, the CFO of our household, almost immediately. A 20-foot-tall Santa welded from scrap metal. Pros: industrial, imposing, post-apocalyptic Christmas vibe. Cons: my welding skills are limited to watching 3 minutes of a tutorial before getting bored. High probability of setting the house on fire. HOA bylaw 12 explicitly forbids permanent structures of a rusted or salvaged nature. They'd have me on a technicality. Hologram Santa projected onto Carol Frump's garage door. Pros: non-physical, therefore not an effigy in the traditional sense. Technologically advanced revenge. Cons: costs more than a new car. Almost certainly counts as harassment. I might be petty, but I'm not get a restraining order petty yet. A life-sized gingerbread house. Pros: whimsical, smells incredible. Cons: see Ham Santa, but replace dogs and bears with ants and children. Sarah pointed out that a single rainy day would turn it into a pile of tragic, sugary mush on our lawn. I was getting frustrated. Everything was either too expensive, too illegal, or too likely to attract vermin. I slumped in my chair at 3 in the morning, nursing a cold cup of coffee and the bitter taste of defeat. Was this it? Was I going to have to settle for a snowflake projector? Was Carol Fromp going to stand on her porch, sipping her decaf soy latte in smug beige victory? Never. I typed one last desperate phrase into the search bar. Large-scale temporary art installations. And that's when I saw it. The search results were a sea of corporate events and art festivals, but one link stood out. It was a website for something called the Fire and Ice Sculpting Championship. I clicked. My screen filled with images of impossible things. A majestic phoenix, wings outstretched, carved from a single, massive block of ice. A life-sized motorcycle, so detailed you could see the treads on the tires. A delicate, intricate castle that looked like it had been pulled directly from a fairy tale. It was beautiful. It was art. And most importantly, it was temporary, made of frozen water, solid, not air-filled. The idea hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so elegant, so utterly, magnificently absurd. An ice sculpture, of course. It wasn't a structure, it was art. It wasn't permanent, it was ephemeral. It adhered to the letter of the law while simultaneously setting the spirit of the law on fire and launching it into the sun. I started laughing, a quiet, slightly maniacal chuckle that soon grew into a full-blown, tear-streaming cackle. This was it. This was the one. I wasn't just going to get a little ice sculpture. A cute 3-foot Santa for the porch. No, no. If I was going to do this, I was going to do this. I was going to commission a monument. A monolith of Yuletide defiance so large, so audacious that it would be whispered about in the annals of Pleasant View Acres for generations. I scribbled in my notebook, underlining the words 3 times. 15-foot-tall Santa, carved from ice. The next morning, I was buzzing with the kind of energy you normally only see in cartoon characters who have just been electrocuted. I made Sarah coffee, her favorite kind, the fancy stuff we only break out on special occasions, and presented it to her with a flourish. "Good morning, my love," I said, my voice oozing charm. "Sleep well?" She eyed me suspiciously over the rim of her mug. "You have your 'I just bought a drone on the internet' face on. What did you do?" "Nothing," I said, feigning innocence. "I simply had an epiphany, a breakthrough in my ongoing war against the forces of suburban darkness. I have found a way to save Christmas." I pulled out my notebook and dramatically flipped it open to the final page, presenting it to her like it was the Declaration of Independence. She read my frantic scrawl. 15-foot-tall Santa, carved from ice. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she took a slow sip of her coffee. Then she stared at it some more. "A statue," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "You want to put a statue on our front lawn?" "An ice statue," I corrected her. "A temporary art installation, technically. It will melt." "It will melt," she repeated, nodding slowly. "It will melt all over the lawn you spend hundreds of dollars on every year. Where does one even get a 15-foot-tall block of ice, Leo?" "Several blocks, actually," I said, consulting my late-night research. "They freeze them special, using a directional freezing process to ensure crystalline clarity. It's fascinating, really." "Fascinating," she echoed, her voice flat. "And how much does this fascinating, crystalline art project cost?" I winced. "Well, that's the thing. It's an investment in our happiness, in our freedom, and, in the arts." "How much, Leo?" I mumbled a number. It was roughly the cost of a decent family vacation, one that involved airplanes. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep, centering breath. I could see her weighing the options. On one hand, a completely insane and extravagant waste of money that would turn our lawn into a swamp and make us the neighborhood pariahs. On the other hand, "What do you think Carol Fromp's face will look like?" I whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "When a refrigerated 18-wheeler pulls up and starts unloading several tons of glacier-grade ice onto our lawn." That was the clincher. I saw the briefest flicker of a smirk on her face. The tiny spark of anarchy that made me fall in love with her in the first place. She was the voice of reason, my grounding force, but she also enjoyed a little well-deserved chaos. And she disliked Carol Fromp almost as much as I did. "You will be responsible for all meltwater-related damages," she said sternly, but her eyes were dancing. "Absolutely," I agreed. "You will deal with every single HOA notice, phone call, and passive-aggressive email." "Consider it done." "And," she said, taking another sip of her coffee, "if this thing starts to lean, you are not, under any circumstances, to try and fix it yourself with our extension ladder and a hairdryer." "You have my word," I said solemnly, raising my right hand. She looked at my notebook one last time, then back at me. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it. Let's give them a Christmas they'll never forget." I felt a surge of triumph. I had secured the go-ahead from Mission Control. Operation Festive Fury was a go. Now I just had to find someone crazy enough to build it. My quest to find a sculptor began, as most modern quests do, with a series of deeply disappointing phone calls. The first number I dialed belonged to a high-end catering company. Elegant Events, this is Tiffany, a cheerful voice chirped. Hi, Tiffany, I said, trying to sound like a normal person with a normal request. I'm looking to commission an ice sculpture. Wonderful. Is this for a wedding or a corporate gala? Our swan luge is very popular. It's more of a private installation, I said. I need a Santa Claus, about 15 feet tall. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of keyboard clicking. 15 inches, sir? Feet, I enunciated, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. Feet like the height of a giraffe. The line went silent for another 3 seconds, and then, with a soft click, Tiffany was gone. The next call was to a company called Ice Creations for You. Their website featured blurry photos of ice bowls for holding shrimp cocktail. The man who answered sounded like he was about 100 years old and deeply tired. Hello? Yes, I'm calling about an ice sculpture. What shape? He grunted. A 15-foot-tall Santa Claus. Son, he said, his voice raspy with disbelief. The biggest block I can get is 4 feet high. You want a Santa for ants? I can make you a Santa for ants. I politely declined the offer of an ant-sized Santa and hung up, feeling a pang of desperation. Was this brilliant plan going to be foiled by simple logistics? Was my monument to malice destined to be nothing more than a fever dream? I went back to the website for the Fire and Ice Sculpting Championship. There had to be someone there, a professional, a true artist who wouldn't be scared off by a little ambition. I scrolled through the list of past winners, their names a blur of international talent. And then I saw him. A 3-time champion in the single block category. A man with a glorious, unkempt beard and the intense stare of a mad prophet. His name was Ivan Petrov, but his bio listed his professional title as Ivan the Iceman Petrov. His website was a single, stark page, with a handful of grainy photos of his work. A snarling wolf, a weeping angel, a terrifyingly realistic kraken. The site's tagline was simple and direct. If it can freeze, I can carve. This was my guy. I dialed the number listed. It rang twice before a voice answered, a voice that sounded like gravel being churned in a cement mixer. Da? Hello? Is this Ivan Petrov? This is Ivan, the voice rumbled. Hi, my name is Leo Maxwell. I found your website and I was hoping to commission a piece. What piece? He asked. The words clipped and impatient. He sounded like he was in the middle of wrestling a bear. I need a Santa Claus, I said, bracing for rejection. 15 feet tall, to be installed on my front lawn. There was a pause. Unlike the others, it wasn't a pause of confusion. It felt more like evaluation, like he was sizing me up through the phone. 15 feet, he repeated, the number rolling off his tongue like a challenge. This is not for shrimp. This is substantial. Yes, very substantial, I said eagerly. Heroic, even. My work is not cheap, he warned. I'm prepared to invest in quality, I replied, trying to sound like a man who regularly commissions 15-foot ice sculptures. Another pause. I come for consultation, tomorrow. 10 a.m. you send address. He hung up before I could even say goodbye. The next morning, at precisely 9:59 a.m., a vehicle pulled up to my curb that could only be described as a post-apocalyptic utility van. It was a faded, indeterminate color, somewhere between rust and despair, with a massive dent in the side panel that looked suspiciously like the outline of a large hoof. The back doors were held shut with a thick chain and a padlock. The driver's side door creaked open, and Ivan Petrov unfolded himself onto the pristine asphalt of Pleasant View Acres. He was even more intimidating in person. He was a mountain of a man, built like a Soviet-era refrigerator, with a wild mane of graying hair and a beard that looked like it might contain nesting birds. He wore a red and black flannel shirt over a thermal, faded jeans, and heavy work boots. He smelled faintly of gasoline, pine needles, and uncompromising artistic vision. He strode onto my lawn and surveyed the area not like a contractor, but like a general planning a battlefield campaign. He kicked at the turf with his boot. He squinted at the position of the sun. He looked at Carol Fromp's perfectly symmetrical house next door and grunted with what I could only interpret as disdain. "This is location," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, this is it," I said, walking out to meet him. I felt small and soft next to him, a suburban house cat next to a Siberian tiger. "You want Santa?" he said, turning his intense gaze on me. "Jolly Santa? Wavin', with rosy cheeks?" He said the words, rosy cheeks, with the same contempt a five-star chef might say, ketchup. "Exactly," I said, my enthusiasm undimmed. "The jollier the better, a classic, the whole 9 yards. Big belly, bag of toys, the twinkle in his eye." Ivan scoffed, a deep, rattling sound from his chest. "This is not art. This is kitsch, a holiday cartoon. Why not something with meaning, something with soul?" "I'm very open to soul," I said carefully. "As long as the soul is jolly and holding a bag of toys." He ignored me, his eyes glazing over as inspiration took hold. "I see him," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Not fat, strong, like old god of winter. He stands on mountain of skulls of his enemies." "Skulls," I repeated weakly. "I'm not sure skulls are in the spirit of the holiday season, or the HOA bylaws for that matter." "Fine," he grumbled, waving a dismissive hand the size of a catcher's mitt. "No skulls, but he cannot be this Coca-Cola clown. How about Santa wrestling a great polar bear, a symbol of man's eternal struggle against the brutal indifference of nature during the cold winter?" "That's very metaphorical," I said, trying to steer this runaway train back onto the tracks. "But I live in a neighborhood where the biggest struggle against nature is crabgrass. We need to stick to jolly. My primary goal here is to annoy my neighbor, the HOA president. A wrestling bear might be too abstract for her. She needs to look out her window and see pure, unfiltered, joyous Christmas." Ivan stared at me, his brow furrowed. And then, for the first time, a flicker of understanding, and perhaps respect, appeared in his eyes. "Ah," he said, a slow, deep rumble. "This is not art project, this is spite project." "It's a multi-purpose project," I corrected him. "It's art, and it's spite. A beautiful fusion of the two." A slow grin spread across Ivan's face, cracking the stoic facade like ice on a thawing lake. It was a terrifying and wonderful sight. "A spite sculpture," he boomed, slapping me on the back so hard I stumbled forward. "I like this. For this I give you discount. A professional courtesy discount." We spent the next hour haggling and planning. He explained the logistics with the precision of an engineer. He would need 10 giant blocks of ice, each weighing over 300 pounds, delivered by a special refrigerated truck. He would need access to a dedicated 20-amp exterior outlet for his tools. He drew a sketch on a notepad he pulled from his van, and his initial Strong Santa design slowly morphed back toward a more traditional, albeit still incredibly heroic, version. He designed a Santa with his chin held high, gazing off into the distance as if looking toward the future of Christmas itself. His bag of toys overflowed, and his stance was one of pure, unshakable, festive authority. He wasn't just jolly, he was majestic, a sentinel of cheer. "He will be magnificent," Ivan declared, his voice filled with newfound passion. "He will loom over this pathetic little house of your enemy. She will look out her window and see only judgment, the judgment of St. Nicholas." "I love it," I said, my heart soaring. We shook on it. His grip was like a hydraulic press. He named his price. Even with the spite discount, it was enough to make my stomach do a little flip-flop. But as I looked across the lawn at Carol Fromp's beige siding and perfectly pruned rose bushes, I knew it would be worth every single penny. "The ice arrives Friday," Ivan announced as he climbed back into his apocalyptic van. "My work begins Saturday, at dawn. Warn your people." The van roared to life with a sound like a dragon clearing its throat and rumbled away, leaving a faint cloud of blue smoke hanging in the pristine suburban air. I stood alone on my lawn, giddy with what I had just set in motion. The Iceman was coming. And hell, a very cold, very festive hell was coming with him. Friday arrived with a palpable sense of doom and spectacle. At precisely 9 a.m., a refrigerated 18-wheeler, a chrome and steel behemoth that was comically oversized for our quiet little cul-de-sac, wheezed its way onto our street. The driver, a man with a weary expression and a coffee stain on his shirt, looked at my house, then at the address on his clipboard, then back at my house, as if he was certain a cosmic error had occurred. The truck's air brakes hissed, a sound that echoed through the unnerving morning silence of Pleasant View Acres. Instantly, curtains began to twitch. A few of my bolder neighbors, like Bob from across the street, actually came out onto their porches, coffee mugs in hand, to witness the strange mechanical beast that had invaded our beige sanctuary. The truck driver clambered down from his cab. "Leo Maxwell?" he called out. "That's me," I said, walking toward him with a confidence I absolutely did not feel. My stomach was doing gymnastics. "Got a delivery for you," he said, gesturing with his thumb toward the massive trailer. 10 blocks of, carving ice." He said carving ice, like he had never uttered the phrase before in his life and hoped to never do so again. "Where do you want 'em?" "Right there on the lawn would be great," I said, pointing to the large blue tarp I had spread out like I was preparing for a very strange picnic. "Just try not to crush the azaleas." What followed was an hour of breathtakingly clumsy and loud construction theater. The back of the truck opened to reveal a foggy, frigid interior where 10 monumental blocks of ice sat shrouded in mist. They were even bigger than I had imagined, perfectly clear, shimmering monoliths that looked like they had been carved from the heart of a glacier. 2 men used a small, groaning crane attached to the truck bed to painstakingly lift each block, swing it over my prize-winning hydrangeas, and lower it onto the tarp with a heavy, ground-shaking thump. With each block that landed, the collective gasp from my spying neighbors grew louder. Bob just shook his head and took a long sip of his coffee. I saw Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down actually taking pictures with her phone. I was already going viral on the neighborhood Facebook group. I could feel it. By the time they were done, my front lawn looked like a bizarre Arctic Stonehenge, 10 crystalline slabs waiting for their creator. The truck rumbled away, leaving me alone with my very expensive, very public declaration of war. Saturday dawned cold and gray. True to his word, Ivan's van appeared at the exact moment the first sliver of sun crested the horizon. He emerged from the cab looking even more like a force of nature than before. He had a thermos in one hand and a battered tool chest in the other. He didn't say good morning. He simply walked to the back of his van, undid the chain and padlock, and began unloading the tools of his trade. It was an arsenal. There were chisels and gouges of every conceivable size. There were power sanders and grinders. And then there were the chainsaws. Not 1, but 3, ranging from a small, nimble one for detail work to a 5-foot monster that looked like it was designed for felling ancient redwoods. He laid them all out neatly on a separate tarp. He filled the big one with gas, pulled the cord, and it roared to life with a sound that shattered the suburban peace. It was a glorious two-stroke battle cry. He spent the first few hours just blocking out the shape. With astonishing speed and precision, he used the giant chainsaw to cleave off huge chunks of ice, sending glittering shards flying across the lawn. He was a dervish of flannel and fury, moving around the ice with a grace that defied his size. Slowly, a rough, towering humanoid form began to emerge from the collection of blocks. The neighborhood was officially captivated. Kids on their way to Saturday morning soccer practice stopped and stared, their parents pulling them along. A few people took their morning walks on our side of the street, slowing down as they passed my house to gawk at the mad Russian artist and his roaring machines. I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, feeling like a mad king watching his monument being built. And then around noon she appeared, Carol Fromp. She marched across her lawn and onto mine, her sensible walking shoes making no sound on the grass. She was clutching her HOA-issued clipboard to her chest like a holy relic, a shield against the vulgarity she was witnessing. Ivan, sensing a disturbance in the artistic force, killed the chainsaw. The sudden silence was more jarring than the noise had been. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, her voice strained as if she were speaking through a mouthful of bees. "What in heaven's name is this?" I put on my most serene, untroubled smile. It was a smile I had been practicing in the mirror all morning. "Why, it's a seasonal art installation, Carol. A little something to bring festive cheer to the neighborhood." "It's a monstrosity," she hissed. "And the noise? It's a violation of Section 7, Article 3. Prohibition of excessive noise from construction or hobbyist activities." I was ready for that. I pulled a folded copy of the bylaws from my back pocket. "Ah," I said, unfolding it. "If you'll look closer at Section 7, you'll note that the prohibition applies only before 8 a.m. and after 8 p.m. on weekends. It is currently," I checked my watch dramatically, "12:15 in the afternoon. We are well within the legally permitted time frame for noisy hobbyist activities." Her face, already a pale shade of beige, seemed to lose another few degrees of color. Her eyes darted from me to the half-formed ice giant on my lawn, then to Ivan, who was wiping grease from a chainsaw blade with a rag and watching her with bored intensity. This is a structure," she stammered, trying a different tack. "It's over 6 feet tall. You need a permit from the Architectural Review Committee for any structure exceeding 6 feet. "Another excellent point, Carol," I said, my smile never wavering. "However, as defined in the glossary of the bylaws, page 47, I believe, a structure is defined as a permanent or semi-permanent edifice affixed to the property. This, as you can see, is made of ice. It is, by its very nature, temporary. It's not affixed to anything. It's art. Once the season is over, it will simply return to nature." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, making little goldfish motions. She was sputtering, short-circuiting on the fact that I had not only read her sacred texts, but was now using them against her. It was at this moment that Ivan decided to intervene. He took a heavy step forward, his shadow falling over Carol. He loomed. "You disturb the process," he growled, his voice a low threat. He tapped one of the blocks of ice with a thick finger. "The ice. It is like a living thing. It feels your negative energy. It makes the molecules unstable." Carol Fromp, a woman who could stare down a landscape contractor for planting a shrub 2 inches off-center, took an involuntary step back. The sight of a giant, flannel-clad man holding a piece of heavy machinery and talking about negative energy molecules was clearly outside the scope of her experience. "This is not over, Mr. Maxwell," she squeaked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "There will be an emergency board meeting. There will be fines." She turned and scurried back to the safety of her own perfectly manicured lawn, the clipboard held tight. Ivan watched her go, then turned to me. "Her molecules are very unstable," he said with a nod. He pulled the cord on the chainsaw, and the glorious roar filled the air once more. Over the next day and a half, Santa emerged. Ivan switched from the big chainsaw to the smaller tools, his movements becoming more precise and delicate. He carved the gentle curve of a belly, the deep folds of a coat, the intricate fur on a cuff. The face was the last thing to emerge. With a small, whirring Dremel-like tool, he etched a pair of eyes that seemed to twinkle even in the flat daylight. He carved a magnificent, flowing beard that looked soft enough to touch. By Sunday evening, it was done. He was 15 feet of solid, crystalline awesome, a silent, majestic giant standing sentinel on my lawn. Ivan had even carved a small, detailed teddy bear peeking out of the top of the toy sack. It was a masterpiece of art, a masterpiece of spite. I paid Ivan the rest of his invoice in cash. He counted it, nodded, and packed his tools. "He is good, no?" he said, looking up at his creation with a rare hint of pride. "He's perfect, Ivan," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." He gave a single, gruff nod, climbed into his van, and rumbled off into the sunset, leaving me alone with my glorious frozen champion. That night, I set up 2 powerful LED spotlights I'd bought just for the occasion. When I flipped the switch, the ice sculpture came alive. It caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It glowed. It dominated the landscape. It was, without a doubt, the most beautiful and ridiculous thing I had ever seen. And from my porch, I had a perfect view of the single, darkened window of Carol Frump's house, where I knew she was standing, watching, and seething. Victory was sweet, and very, very cold. For 2 blissful days, I was the undisputed king of the cul-de-sac. My ice Santa was a local phenomenon. People who I hadn't spoken to in years would drive by my house, slow their cars to a crawl, and just stare. Some would get out and take pictures. The neighborhood kids were completely mesmerized. They'd stand on the sidewalk, their faces upturned, talking about it in hushed, reverent tones, as if it were a genuine miracle. I took to sitting on my front porch in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket with a mug of hot chocolate, just basking in the glory of it all. I felt a sense of profound, smug satisfaction every time a car passed. Sarah would come out and shake her head, but she was smiling. We'd won. We'd beaten the HOA at their own game. The sculpture was so undeniably impressive, so artistically sound, that Carol Frump seemed to be at a loss. No letters appeared in our mailbox. No passive-aggressive emails landed in my inbox. There was only a tense, silent stalemate. The silence was broken on Wednesday night. I was admiring the way the spotlights made Santa's beard glitter when a car pulled up to my curb. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a police cruiser. It sat there for a moment, its presence an ugly, flashing intrusion on my perfect festive scene, before 2 officers got out. My heart did a little pitter-patter of anxiety, but I held my ground. I hadn't broken any laws. I was ready for this. The 2 officers ambled up my driveway. One was older, with a thick mustache and a world-weary slump to his shoulders. The other was younger, fitter, and looked like he was trying very hard not to be amused. And right behind them, practically vibrating with righteous indignation, was Carol Frump. Of course, she'd gone nuclear. "Evening, sir," the older officer said. His name tag read Miller. "You Leo Maxwell?" "I am," I said politely. "Is there a problem, officers?" "We received a complaint," Miller said, gesturing vaguely toward my lawn with his thumb. "About the, He paused, searching for the right word. "The structure," Carol interjected, her voice sharp. the unapproved, oversized, light-polluting structure. Miller's partner, whose tag read Davis, looked up at the 15-foot-tall glowing Santa, then back at his partner, a completely deadpan expression on his face. "It's a Santa Claus, Frank," he said. "I can see that, Mark," Miller sighed. He turned back to me. "Ma'am here says it's a public nuisance." "It's an ice sculpture, officer," I explained calmly, channeling my inner lawyer. "A temporary art installation for the holiday season. It's on my private property and it's not violating any city ordinances." "The light pollution is egregious," Carol insisted. "It's shining directly into my bedroom window." Officer Davis looked at her house, then at my spotlights, which were aimed directly upward at the statue. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat, "your blinds are closed." Carol sputtered. "Well, I can see the glow through the blinds. It's distracting." Officer Miller rubbed the bridge of his nose, the very picture of a man who was questioning all of his life choices that had led him to this moment, standing on a suburban lawn at 9 o'clock at night, mediating a dispute over a giant ice Santa. "Sir," he said to me, his voice heavy with resignation, "is there a law in this city against ice?" "Not to my knowledge, officer," I replied. "And it's not blocking the sidewalk? It's not a traffic hazard?" "Nope. Fully contained on my property." Miller turned to Carol. "Ma'am, with all due respect, there's nothing we can do here. The man has a large Santa on his lawn. It's unusual, but it's not illegal." Carol looked like she was about to explode. Her face was a blotchy red. She was defeated. The law itself was on my side. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. And that's when I felt it. A single drop of water on my cheek. I looked up. The sky was clear, studded with stars. That was odd. Then another drop. I glanced at Santa, and my blood ran cold. He was sweating. A thin sheen of moisture coated his entire majestic form, glistening in the spotlights. A tiny, steady drip was falling from the tip of his nose. Drip, drip, drip. The weather report had promised a cold snap, temperatures dropping into the 20s all week. The weather report, it turned out, was a filthy liar. A freak warm front was moving in from the south. I'd seen it on the news and thought nothing of it. The temperature, which had been a crisp 30 degrees when the sun went down, was now climbing. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a weather alert. Unseasonably warm temperatures expected overnight, reaching the high 50s. "Well," Officer Miller said, clapping his hands together, "if that's everything, we'll be on our way. Try to have a peaceful night, folks." But I wasn't listening. I was watching in horror as the drip from Santa's nose became a trickle. The moisture on his cheeks was running now, carving little rivulets down his magnificent beard. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, coming out onto the porch after seeing the police car. "He's melting," I whispered, my voice a horrified croak. The trickle became a steady stream. A small puddle was forming at the base of the statue, and because my lawn had the slightest, almost imperceptible grade, that puddle was beginning to flow. It was creeping across the grass, a dark, sinister tendril of water heading directly for the property line. Directly for Carol Frump's award-winning, meticulously cultivated, prize petunia garden. Carol saw it at the same moment I did. Her eyes widened in horror. "My petunias!" she shrieked. Your effigy is attacking my petunias." The scene descended into absolute chaos. Santa's right arm, the one holding the overflowing bag of toys, suddenly slumped with a sickening, slushy sound. The teddy bear carved at the top slid off and landed on the lawn with a wet thwump. "Do something!" Carol screamed at me. I was panicking. I ran into the garage and came back with a garden trowel, frantically trying to dig a makeshift trench to redirect the flow of water towards the storm drain. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, ran back inside and started bringing out every single bath towel we owned, throwing them onto the grass to build a pathetic, soggy dam. The two cops, Miller and Davis, were standing by their car, frozen in a state of beautiful, professional disbelief. I'm almost certain I saw Officer Davis cover his mouth to hide a laugh. The grand finale came when Santa's entire head, weighed down by its own magnificent hat, listed slowly to one side and then fell off completely. It hit the ground with a sound like a car crash made of slush, sending a tidal wave of ice-cold water surging directly into Carol's flower bed. It was a catastrophe. It was a disaster. It was the most hilarious and fitting end to my monument of spite I could have possibly imagined. My glorious Santa hadn't been defeated by the HOA or the police. He'd been brought down by a warm front and the simple, unforgiving laws of thermodynamics. And in his final, glorious act of defiance, he had taken the petunias with him. The next morning, the scene on my lawn was one of pure, pathetic carnage. The majestic 15-foot Santa was gone. In his place was a lumpy, sad-looking mound of ice, about the size of a large beanbag chair, slowly weeping itself into oblivion. The lawn was a swamp. The bath towels were a soggy, tragic mess, and Carol Fromp's petunia garden looked like it had been the site of a localized flash flood. There were no more letters, no more emergency board meetings. Carol didn't even speak to me directly. Instead, a few days later, I received a very formal invoice in the mail from her lawyer. It was for the complete restoration of a prize-winning floral display, plus an additional line item for infliction of petunia-related emotional distress. I wrote her a check, and I have to admit, I did it with a flourish. I even added, "for the petunias," in the memo line. It felt like a small price to pay for the sheer, unadulterated joy of the preceding chaos. A week later, just before Christmas, a new envelope appeared in my mailbox. Another crisp manila missive from the HOA. I opened it with a sense of calm satisfaction. It was, as I'd expected, a notice for another new bylaw. Article 9, Section 4C, a ban on temporary statuary exceeding 4 feet in height, composed of frozen or thawing materials. I smiled. They had made a rule just for me. They had been forced to specifically legislate against a melting Santa Claus. If that wasn't a victory, I didn't know what was. I bought a cheap frame from the craft store, and I hung the new bylaw in my home office, right next to my college diploma. It felt like a far greater achievement. My inflatable army remained in the garage that year, but my reputation in Pleasant View Acres was forever cemented. I wasn't just Leo Maxwell from 4B anymore. I was the ice Santa guy. I'd get knowing nods from strangers at the community pool. People would stop me at the grocery store. "You're the one," they'd say with a grin. "You're the legend." The following Christmas, as I was on my lawn dutifully setting up a simple, elegant, and HOA-approved display of white lights, Bob from across the street wandered over, a twinkle in his eye. "Heard a rumor you were looking into a 20-foot-tall Easter bunny," he said, his voice low. "Something about sculpting it out of butter?" I just smiled, a quiet, secretive smile. My work was done, for now. As I stood there, plugging in the lights that made my house look just like every other house on the block, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had fought the great war of aesthetic harmony and emerged, if not completely unscathed, then at least legendary. I had proven that even in the most beige of places, a little bit of glorious, oversized, and poorly timed absurdity could make a world of difference. And they say there's no magic left in the suburbs.